Side podcast, where we cover everything about common sense hurricane survival. I'm your host, Jamie Robe, and now for today's show. Hi, I'd like to welcome you to podcast number 1. Today's date is September 13th, 2019, and we are going to follow a format on most of these podcasts where we're going to do a quick overview of the tropics. Again, this is not a forecast in any way, shape, or form. What we're going to do is just review some of the Hurricane Center maps and just take a look, just like we were sitting around a coffee table. Because I myself am not a meteorologist, but I'm very interested, of course, in what's going on in the tropics. And then we're going to share a preparation tip or a question. In this case, today it'll be a tip. And hopefully this gives you some useful information in a quick, podcast. So what I'm going to do now is go over and start looking at the weather. And I'm going to, of course, go to the National Hurricane Center maps. And I like to start on the 5-day graphical tropical weather outlook myself, because it kind of gives you what's going on and what is expected to happen. And you can see down in the Atlantic area that we're looking at first, we've got this disturbance area they call number 9, and they're expecting it to turn into a tropical storm possibly over the next few days. And then there's some other areas further out. And the way that you really look at these is you can hover over and it'll tell you what kind of an overview of what's going on. So in this case, you can see it's a pretty high chance. Hurricane Center saying an 80% chance in 2 days that it'll develop, or 90% over 5 days. But you can see right now it's sustained winds of 30, so it's not really a big deal right this second. But if we want to see further out in detail, we can click on that X, and this brings up the forecasting maps and advisories and things. So, again, this is probably the most useful thing to look at here is their forecast cone. Okay, so just like last week where we had the terrible Hurricane Dorian, which was in a similar area, and right now the Hurricane Center is showing this only to be a depression, but it's going to dump some rain and be potentially a tropical storm right over the area where Dorian sat for 2 days. So keep those people in our prayers down in the Bahamas. This one, it looks like, it's going to actually curve out to sea, but they are showing some potential impacts along the southeast coast of the U.S. on the Atlantic side. So you can scroll down and they have more information on this page, but basically these are the key things to look at. You can also look at the public advisories, and this is the kind of the written description about what they're saying. So you can see there's a tropical storm warning already in effect in for the Bahamas, and also for even Flagler, Volusia County in Florida. So those are kind of the overview of the Atlantic basin. And but you have to remember, some of our listeners and viewers, readers, they are in other parts of the United States. So you can look down on the eastern, northern Pacific, and there's always lots of activity out here. Luckily, most of this stuff moves out over the ocean, and sometimes it'll impact on this coast here. But almost always look down here, even when there isn't anything in the Atlantic. Often there's storms in this part of the Pacific. And another place to check, of course, is the Central Pacific, and this is the Hawaiian Island area. So they've got a couple of areas that have 20% chances of developing. So again, these are things that, it's good to take a look at on a regular basis. I definitely check it every day. Other people may check it only when they see there's an alert or something on the news. But this is important to be able to know where to find these things. Again, always check with the National Hurricane Center and the official weather forecasts for making any sort of decisions about what you're doing in case of a storm. And now I'm going to go over to our next item, which is a tip. So I'm going to flip up our hunkerdown.guide website. So if you haven't already gone here, it's www.hunkerdown.guide. And it's a website I've created. It's dedicated to hurricane preparation and survival. And our first tip on this podcast is going to be pretty obvious to many people, but some people may not think about this. It's always important to know if your home or apartment or condo, whatever you live in, is it located on an evacuation zone on an official hurricane map. Okay, so to help people find that information quickly, basically you can look under the storm threatening button on the website, and you'll see there's a table of contents, and on the left you can click on evacuate or not. And I've got some kind of rules of thumb to follow and some questions to ask yourself about your situation and your needs, and about if you should evacuate or not. Well, here's one of the main question that we're really looking at today. It's, do you live in a hurricane evacuation zone that's likely to have a mandatory evacuation at some point in the future? So you can read through this whole thing, but basically on here is a list that I've compiled that I started at the beginning of the hurricane season, so it's pretty up to date. And it is a link to the state and local hurricane evacuation maps. Right, this one has it listed state by state. So I'm going to go down to just use an example, Florida, where I happen to live. So here's a link to the floridadisaster.org, Know Your Zone. Now, every state and every locality seems to have a slightly different take on how to present this material. Florida is probably a really good example of what works well. So you come down here to Know Your Zone, and if you look in Florida, the disaster zone maps and everything are located by the county level. So some states are at a statewide level, some have very extensive information, and some don't have very good information. But we're going to click on Hillsborough County, which is the Tampa area, and they have a very nice setup here, and one of them is Find Your Evacuation Zone. So I'm going to click on this, and this is going to load an interactive map. Now, some localities have a PDF file or some other type of mapping system, but in this case, this map, I'm going to move this around a little bit. But you can see, if you know this area at all, this is Tampa. And here's Tampa Bay. Now notice over in Pinellas County at St. Petersburg, that's not on this map because these are out at the county level. So this map actually shows you where the shelters are that would open up in case there's a storm threat. In this case, all the shelters are closed. And even designated shelter is pet friendly. But what we're talking about today is how do you find out if you're in an evacuation zone? So in this case, they've shaded the different levels of evacuation requirements, starting in this kind of pink color and working their way through yellow and into green. And so those red pink areas are zone A. And what happens in a case of a storm is really threatening an area, the officials will decide if they're going to call for mandatory evacuations. So in theory, everyone that lives in this pink area is going to have to evacuate or should evacuate if they say a zone A, level A evacuation. And that has to do with the storm surge threats. So as you can see, if they did all the way to Zone E, which is actually this lighter blue area, it's like a huge area of this particular city. So they can call different levels of evacuation. Now, in these zones are literally hundreds of thousands of people's homes and apartments and businesses. And so you can find on a map like this and locate your address. This one happens to have an interactive address search function. Some don't. You just have to kind of find yourself on the map. This map is also nice because it has routes to the different shelters. That would, I guess they would activate public transportation that would zoom through these areas and pick people up on buses. So this is a well thought out mapping system in this particular county and in Florida. So that's basically what you have to find. Again, it's important to, look through these map resources, and we could go to any county in Florida that has evacuation maps, and the other states are similar. But it's very important that you take a look at those and find out way in advance if you are in an evacuation zone or not. And so that's really what I have to talk about today. Again, our site is hunkerdown.guide, and we have information on preparing before a storm, when a storm's threatening, and then recovering after a storm. So, and you'll also find more of these podcasts on the site. So with that, I'd like to wish you all a great Friday the 13th, and keep watching and preparing. Thank you. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll join us at www.hunkerdown.guide. With honesty and gentle words, we sailed together in a caravel against the winds our freedoms hold. Against the winds our truths be told, and told, and told, and told. Flashes in your eyes, clap the thunder in my soul. Across the deep that rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls. Across the deep that rolls and rolls.